Hi, Noel.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, I'm really glad to have you actually. You are an impressive woman. You have quite an impressive curriculum. Can you describe maybe a little bit more what you're doing in your daily life?
Sure. I came to Brussels actually because I wanted to work in science policy. Now I'm a project manager with the Belgian Federal Institutes, but I work also quite closely with the European Space Agency. Part of my daily life is managing part of the Belgian space program and satellite projects, but the other part is doing science policy work at a European level. Sometimes I work on giving advice and reading policy briefs from the European Commission and Parliament. Sometimes I work with scientific organizations as a science policy officer. I provide different advice to different groups. It's quite a varied but really interesting and fun work that I do here in Brussels.
How would you define the role of a climate scientist? And do you think that your work has some sort of impact?
I think a climate scientist these days, it's not such a simple answer because we have such a wide range of responsibilities and roles that you can fill as a climate scientist. So on one hand, I would say there's a spectrum that a scientist can fall in, regardless of the field that you're in. On one end of the spectrum, you're a pure scientist. You do your research, you publish papers, you get funding, you have your own research groups, you teach courses at a university perhaps. You don't engage at all with activism or with science policy efforts. But then on the wide end of this spectrum, I would say, is someone who's quite active in outreach and policy efforts and is using their science to have a societal impact, perhaps working directly on societal needs and issues, or perhaps doing activism like I have been doing over the last several years. And then in between you have a spectrum of people who fill different roles at different levels. So a climate scientist in particular, because of the type of research that we do and the societal relevance of our science, I think we have perhaps a stronger mandate than the average scientist to communicate the science that we do and to fill other roles that provide a more direct societal need. And that's why I felt compelled to do something that was much more than a pure scientist, that was closer to the science policy sphere and to be able to have a more impactful result from my research.
Okay, so if I understood correctly, the fact is that as a climate scientist, you think that there is something more that you have to do in your daily life because of the situation we are in today.
Absolutely. I feel compelled to do it. It doesn't mean every single scientist should. You should do what you're comfortable with and what you personally feel is right for you. But for me, that means doing science policy activities, working on policies and helping write amendments for laws, serving as a policy officer and helping other scientists who are interested in also becoming more active. That's right for me. I feel like climate change and the climate crisis and the environmental issues that we're facing right now have compelled me and many other scientists to be more active.
It's nice to hear somehow, I guess. You know, there's something as an activist, but also as a person, that I'm forced to see is that the report and all the amazing work that dozens of scientists have been doing the last years, are those reports still useful, do you think? Have they been visible enough? Maybe this is a lot of questions at the same time. But
Well, it's a good question because some climate scientists would tell you the science is settled. The report exists to provide information to everyone else, but also to climate scientists to continue to inspire and show areas where we do need more research. But there's a big section at the front of the IPCC report that's a summary for policymakers, and that exists for a very specific reason. We want change. We want to influence and enable governments and stakeholders to enact this change because we see it as so incredibly urgent and relevant. The reports themselves were originally intended to be a summary of the existing research and information, so they weren't necessarily intended to be visible. Perhaps I'm not entirely sure about this, but from what I know, it happened organically because the science is so incredibly relevant for society. The fact that it's becoming more visible and now more and more people have heard about, the average person has probably heard about the IPCC reports and knows what the COP meetings are doing because it's been so relevant and publicized in the news. And that's been for a very important and good reason. Now, is it enough? That's hard to say. Certainly, the people for whom it is relevant, it is known, and there has been a fantastic campaign to make sure that that information is getting to the people who need it. And it also isn't necessary that the average person reads the IPCC report, of course. It's massive. It's over 1,000 pages for this newest one, I believe. So that visibility doesn't necessarily have to be in the science itself, but more in the importance and the relevance to people and the particular things that the average person can do just to get people to care. I think that's where we have been successful in bringing that awareness to the average person.
Yes, and maybe, I don't know, I don't think everybody knows what are in those reports. Do you think you could just, for the people who might listen to us today and look at this video, try to summarize the important point?
Sure. There is a basis of what climate change is, how we know that it's happening, and what the effects are. So we understand basic atmospheric chemistry and the process of greenhouse gases increasing the average global temperature, so that's explained. Also the effects of particular gases in the atmosphere and how they change the climate, whether it's a warming or a cooling influence. And then it goes deeper into what those effects are as a result of climate change. So there is a breakdown of the effects on particular regions or particular groups of people, particular countries, and the repercussions of that. So it's a summary of the science that exists, the best possible climate science in all of these different spheres that are impacted by those, by the changes.
And maybe it's going to be the big question of today. Do you think we are doomed as a person, as a scientist?
That's an interesting question. If you had asked me that a few years ago, I think my answer would have been a bit different. I personally have been struggling with the emotional and mental health impacts of being exposed to climate science and to seeing the information, the news, the articles, reports about the devastating environmental impacts of humans. And I realized a few years ago that I was suffering from something called ecological grief. And it was quite strong to the point that I actually had to pull back from social media and stop exposing myself on a daily basis to these changes. I remember actually seeing a report about a scientist who works at the Great Barrier Reef, and he studies the biodiversity there. And in the interview, he was describing the emotional distress he was feeling from seeing the mass bleaching events that were occurring off the coast of Australia. And he was crying in the interview because he was just so deeply affected and traumatized by the fact that it's something like 90% of reefs have been either partially or in some cases entirely bleached or devastated by these effects. And as someone who loves and cares about the environment and the species that you work with as a scientist, it was just devastating for him. And I realized I was feeling exactly the same way. And if you had asked me then, I certainly would have said it feels like we're doomed sometimes, especially when you work in the science policy sphere and you see how slow and difficult it can be to enact changes. You really do feel like we're walking into the inferno, that we're not taking care of our society or our future generations in a fast enough or meaningful enough way. And that can be incredibly devastating because I'm a scientist, but I'm still human and I'm still affected by that. But there is a much bigger part of me, and certainly it's been improving over the last few years. This part of me has a lot of optimism and a lot of hope because I see that people are standing up, they're caring, they're putting energy and time and effort into, at the very least, listening and understanding these things. And just the fact that people are willing to try gives me hope. So I would say, in some ways, climate change is already causing devastating impacts. And for some parts of the world, certainly for the loss of biodiversity, for the species that have gone extinct, obviously that's quite clear doom. But for humanity itself, we're not doomed yet. We have time and we have an incredible amount of hope and optimism and people who are willing to put in the work to to save us and to save other species. I would like to think we're not doomed. I would like to think that we're going to find a way to turn this around and that we have a future to look forward to.
Thank you. And you're not only a person, more than a scientist, you're also an artist, which is amazing, by the way. An amazing artist. I've had the chance to see your work already. And why did you choose this medium to reach the public?
I didn't choose it, actually. I've always been an artist. I just happened to go into science instead of art. So that was more of an accident than anything. But I realized through art, it's another way that I can communicate with people. So I've always had art as something that I've done just for myself, but I realized over the last few years, I got very lucky and started talking to the Belgian art community, people who do street art, and I started doing some pieces in the streets of different cities in Flanders and Brussels, and I just found the feedback to be wonderful, and I realized people, when they see me painting, when they ask questions about what art I'm working on, what it means, what the ideas behind it are, when they're inspired by it, it's another way to reach people that I haven't yet been able to as a scientist, because not everybody is going to go to a science lecture or read the IPCC report. I mean, very clearly there are many people who are just trying to live their lives every day and aren't going to have the time or energy to do the kind of activism that you do, for example, or that I do. I mean, those kind of people can be reached in other ways. And I find art to be an amazing tool for that, because science is one thing that some people are very passionate about, like myself, but art is something else that a different group of people can be very passionate about and touches people on an emotional level. And the art piece that I just did for an expo that's actually still running right now, it talks about my experience with biodiversity and the recent science policy work that I've been doing in biodiversity and protecting species, and the fact that climate change is going to wipe out many, if not most, species on this planet unless we find a way to mitigate that. And in dealing with that struggle, I created a very large canvas to showcase the way I foresaw the future, in that it's pessimistic because I imagine that most species have gone extinct, but it's optimistic because I imagine a future in which new species have evolved, and they're beautiful, and they're unique, and they're unlike anything we've seen. So through this, and through discussing it, I found that even scientists were inspired, that in ways that they weren't expecting, let alone the average person who sees the artwork and just enjoys it, and then maybe reads a little bit of the information next to the art piece and says, oh, this is teaching me something too. So I find it to be a wonderful tool, and I'm so fortunate that I get to also communicate with people that way.
I'm sure of it, and I was really amazed again by your work. Talking about tools and solutions, I tend and I try to close my videos and everything with some kind of solution, some kind of action, some kind of tools for the people that are going to watch us. And what would be just an advice that you would give to those people that are going to watch us? What would be your final message for them?
I wish I could give you an easy solution, like if you bring recycling bags to the grocery store, that'll fix everything. I wish it was that easy. I would say the best thing that the average person can do right now is just to talk about it. Ask questions, listen, talk to others about things that you care about, read a little more. Just try and show a little bit of interest, and if you feel inspired to do so, go attend a climate activism rally, go watch a science talk. There's lots of free and really, really fun opportunities available for people to just get a little bit more inspired and to learn a little bit more about the environment. And go just explore the world and remind yourself that this is a beautiful place full of wonderful species. Humans are one of them. Remind yourself of that wonder and delight that we all feel as children, that sometimes people can forget as we get older. I think that's the best way for us to get out of this crisis that we're in, is just to remind people that this is our planet. It's the only one we have, and we need to protect it.
Thank you very much for today. I learned a lot, and I hope that the people that are still here will too, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much, Quels, for having me.